Welcome to my budget deck channel, where I try to make decks as cheap and playable as possible, so you have multiple decks to play with or just have some nice decks on the side. So if this sounds like something you'd be interested in, why don't you check out my channel or leave a subscribe. And today I had a look at Dark Magician. It's been a bit of a subscriber slash watcher request. I sometimes do those, not all the time, but if I feel like I want to take the challenge, or I actually already have a good idea, or actually have the cards to do so, then I will do that. And today I did. I always wanted to have a look at Dark Magician. I drew one out of a pack, and from that point onwards I tried desperately to make this a playable deck without using more than 10 super rares, and basically only ultra rares to use as Dark Magician, possibly the fusion, but in the end it worked out differently, which I will talk about why that is in a second as well. First of all, obviously you want to run Dark Magician in this list. You can run it at 3. I felt like for budget purposes 2 is fine. It doesn't restrict you too much, and if they get banished somehow, then you're going to be in a terrible situation either way. But I felt like in testing it didn't stop me from doing too much, so I felt like 2 usually worked out. If you want to play a third one, there's cards you could take out for it, but I felt like 2 was a perfectly fine ratio, especially for the start. Magician's Rod, a card that you really want to be using in this deck because it can search out your playmakers. Dark Magician has a bit of a problem, and that is that you kind of need lots of cards to work together to form a deck. It's not as one card combo linearly as some other kind of modern decks these days are, because you kind of want to summon Dark Magician a lot of the time, while also have it in your hand or graveyard, while having some continuous spell on board that then does stuff and whatnots. So it's a little bit hard, and this card makes the whole concept of the deck a little bit easier. Also, you can recur this card, so in the end it is actually not too bad. Now for a little spice that I put into this deck, because this works well in combination with other cards, and I'll talk about, if you don't want to run the small Witchcrafter engine, what you could run instead. But first things first, I would suggest running 3 Witchcrafter Schmeta, because this card can easily go into Hain, which is level 7. It's a disruption, it's a spellcaster, and protects your spellcasters, which most of the time won't be coming in too handy because, well, Dark Magician has no text besides being Dark Magician and obviously the ultimate wizard in terms of attack and defense, I think. But this card is quite a neat disruption, and in combination with the effect of Schmeta, you basically go into Schmeta, discard one of your spell cards that you don't use, then use the Schmeta effect in the graveyard and send Holiday to the graveyard. So in the end phase you will have a Hain on board, and you will have 1 Holiday in graveyard, which you then add to your hand, which you then can use to discard with Hain. Also, in theory, if you don't get to use Hain's effect because Hain gets Kaiju or whatever, you could summon it back next turn with Witchcrafter Holiday, which is also quite a neat combo. You could technically run 2 Schmeta and 1 Ginny, because then you can actually use Holiday in the graveyard to bring Hain back out again. But with this card in conjunction, you would, if you draw Jenny, then have to go into Schmeta, otherwise you'd rely on having more spells in your hand that you want to discard. And if you look through the list, there's not that many spells that you just want to have sitting in hand that are kind of useless to you. So I decided to go for triple Schmeta, which it's up to preference, but I felt like it made more sense most of the time. And the reason why I run this package in here, there's a specific reason, not just to fill the deck with cards, because you could do this with stuff like Dogmatica Punishment, for example. The reason is because I run specific cards that help you clearing your opponent's board a little bit or disrupting their plays while getting Dark Magician on board, which are Successor Soul, a card that's fairly new, I think, in one of the mega tints if I'm not mistaken, and another card that is Dark Renewal. They basically do the same kind of thing, but they have a few different requirements that they can use, and obviously one of them is a spell card, one of them is a trap card. Successor Soul is quite good actually going second as well, because it helps you dodging stuff if your opponent has monsters on board, helps you dodging stuff like Effect Veil and Impermanence, which can be quite annoying if you summon Magician's Rod and then get your search disrupted. So this can kind of stop that by sending the card to the graveyard. The effect still resolves, which is quite nice because you can chain it to it. Problem with this specific card is you need to summon 1 level 7 or higher normal monster from your hand or deck. So if both of your Dark Magicians are in your graveyard, you don't do all that much with this one. And Dark Renewal is a card that can miss timing because it's a win effect, Also, it is a bit problematic in a sense because it only works on your opponent actually summoning, but then you can actually summon a dark spellcaster monster from your deck or graveyard, which is quite nice. So you had this kind of excluded, but you will have enough monsters to actually summon stuff out. You could even summon stuff out like Magician's Rod, but for both of these cards, for this one specifically, you need one spellcaster monster you control. So the Witchcrafter comes in handy possibly, and if you don't draw into Magician's Rod, that is obviously. And with Successor Soul, you have to send one effect monster you control and tribute it, then that also comes in handy. A lot of the time this will be Apprentice Illusion Magician or Magician's Rod, but sometimes it might even be Hane after you already used Hane's effect and don't really know what else to do with it. Then you can use some of these other cards to get your actual Dark Magician plays started. So I felt like this kind of engine that at least does something is still nice. If you want to keep the 3 rares up in form of a spellcaster, but you don't want to run the extra super rare in this deck, I understand, and then you can run Legion the Fiend Gesture actually instead, because if this card is sent from the field to the graveyard, you can add one spellcaster normal monster from your deck or graveyard to your hand, which would be Dark Magician of course, and that is not completely useless in this specific deck. So technically you can normal summon this card and then still use it for Successor Soul or Dark Renewal. Problematic is this card doesn't really do anything by itself. So if you didn't draw into any of those 2 cards, this card is kind of dead, rather than Witchcrafter Shmeta, which is not dead because you can still go into Hane. So I like this kind of option that you can choose. If you draw Shmeta and you have one of the 2 cards, do you want to discard a spell and go into Hane, or do you want the other kind of disruption that you have? And if you don't draw into the other cards, but you will possibly have a spell card in hand because you have ways to search spell cards, and also you have loads of spell cards in your deck, then this kind of combo is a bit better. It makes you run stuff like Book of Moon, which is not terrible, but it's also not an amazing card. I think especially for the going first decks, Dogmatica Punishment in this specific variant would be a lot better to run. But Book of Moon is okay going second against certain boards, and it's not too terrible going first. It doesn't really do anything about your opponent's monster, but they can't use it as a material for most things, which is quite nice. And obviously they cannot attack you and use the effect after. Well, they can't activate it if it's not if this card is summon effect, if you chain it right after the summon. So there is this, but also this has one kind of niche, I would say, usage, and that is Hane is a level 7 which works with Xyz level 7 monsters. Also, you can search a spell card with Eternal Soul, which is Dark Magic Attack, which most of the time you don't want to, but during your opponent's turn, if you don't have a Dark Magician that you can special summon, you can at least use the Eternal Soul to then search Dark Magic Attack, discard Dark Magic Attack for either Witchcraft or Shmeta, use the effect to summon Hane, or even for the Hane effect. So in theory, it's kind of small gears that fit into each other quite well. So I really liked this engine in this deck. It's not perfect, but it fills a gap that this specific variant otherwise would have. Coming up next, Dark Magic Attack. I already talked about this a bit. It's I like the card. It sounds like a really, really strong card, but it just doesn't come up as much as you want it to. Next up, Apprentice Illusion Magician. Very good card. It's kind of the replacement for Magician Souls. It kind of does different things. I think this card works very well in conjunction with stuff like Magician Navigation, but this card isn't as strong as it used to be. So most of the time you would rather run Magician Souls because it gets your monster on board, even if it just itself technically could also get your Dark Magician on board, plus the draw effect is obviously very, very nice. Whether this card special summons your body, discards a card for cost, sadly, and replaces it with Dark Magician, which can also be nice. So if you have Apprentice Illusion Magician, run it. If you'd rather run Magician Souls because you at least drew one of them in the packs, or you had a playset anyway, then it's probably better than Apprentice Illusion Magician, even though the battle effect is something you should not not consider at this point, which is 2000 attack points can be quite nice for your Dark Magician in certain times of trouble against certain at-ignister boards and whatnot. So this card is actually better than you might think. Magician of Dark Illusion, a card that you've probably not seen in a lot of Dark Magician decks recently, but this card would be a very, very banger of a card if it actually was treated as a Dark Magician in the graveyard, because for some reason it is not. It is only on field, which is still fine. You can summon it during your opponent's turn by using a spell or a trap card effect, and then summon it. Then it would trigger Dark Magical Circle if you have it, and even if it doesn't, you can still use it, first of all, as a jump block. Second of all, you could still use it for cards like Successor Assault and Dark Renewal, which is quite nice. So this is another way of going into these. Also, it enables your rank 7s a bit more, which can come in handy. I mean, with, you see, we use stuff like Prolific Extravagance, so it's not that important to have access to rank 7s, but I feel like this card is a little bit underrated, but obviously it can it could be a lot better if it had slightly different text. But the fact that you can target one Dark Magician in your graveyard and special summon it back is also quite neat. Sadly, there's not a real way of recurring this card, so if this is in the graveyard, that's about it. Going to the next card, Pot of Extravagance. You play Control Z deck. You play Control Z deck that doesn't really care about the extra deck, so Pot of Extravagance is the go-to kind of card. Since this deck has no other cards that actually draw cards, it's really neat. It does a lot for your deck. It obviously draws you into more spell trap cards that can disrupt your opponent, more options to get your Dark Magician on board. You could replace it with stuff like Pot of Prosperity if you don't care for the extra draw that much and you want to run the Dark Magicians, which would also very well work with the Witchcrafter kind of thing, because if you draw Hain, it's not a dead card in hand, it's actually a fusion material for the Dark Magicians, which is quite nice. So you could go for this kind of route, go more for Pot of Prosperity, run the fusions, and go on from that. I decided not to because I felt like it didn't feel as good. I like the extra draw, and I stand by that one, but in the end it's up to preference a little bit. Witchcrafter Holiday, a card that is good in recursion and works with the whole combo. You could also run Witchcrafter Scroll, because this card actually does stuff for your spellcasters, because it's not just a Witchcrafter focus card. If it's on board, and since it's a continuous spell, it probably will be, your opponent won't be taking care of this card. If they do, it's mainly by accident or just as an innocent bystander, because they nuke the board anyway. Drawing a card if your spellcaster just was a monster by battle once per turn is not bad, but I feel like Holiday can serve more purposes than Scroll could. Dark Magical Circle, must run in this deck. I know they're all super rares, but this card is very, very strong, and that is not for its search effect actually, because you see, especially in modern Dark Magician decks, you don't run that many of the actual Dark Magician spell traps anymore, because they're just simply not that good, and especially in a budget one where you don't have access to certain ones that I'll be talking about in a second, you won't be turning over that many Dark Magician cards for that matter, especially if you only run 2 Dark Magicians and whatnots, and this card cannot get Magician's Rod, so it's a bit annoying. But stacking your deck isn't terrible, and you have loads of opportunities to actually summon Dark Magician even out of your deck, so this card rarely ever is dead, and if it's dead you could still discard it. With Shmeta you always have to take the gamble. Do I want to look at the top 3 cards, because you then get Eternal Soul and you actually have a Dark Magician in hand and whatnot, can be helpful. But other than this, this card is very good disruption, and in the grind game, this plus Eternal Soul plus 1 Dark Magician in circulation can actually win you the game by itself. And by itself I mean a 3-card combo. Like I said at the start, it takes a bit of a setup. Book of Moon, very strong power spell card, going first and going second, so I wanted to include this, especially since it is a cheap card. There's obviously a lot better cheap, well, not cheap spell cards that you could use, lots of ultra rares that work in a better way, I would say. I think Forbidden Droplet is one of the cards that I would use instead if you have it, but Book of Moon does its job, especially if you want to run the Witchcrafters. Forbidden Chalice, a very good card, same reason, basically same explanation as Book of Moon. I would say even a tiny bit better, but that is up to preference. Illusion Magic, one off because you sometimes want to add Dark Magician back to your hand, and you can search it off of Magician's Rod, so it works and it's not too bad. If you have it in hand and you have no reason for it to use it, then you can still discard it by the Witchcrafters, which is fun. But other than that, yeah, it also can make Successor Soul live again by adding 1 Dark Magician back to your hand, because this card can only summon from hand or deck, not from graveyard, sadly, which brings us to Dark Renewal, a card that is very good to disrupt your opponent and special summon your Dark Magician out during your opponent's turn to then possibly get rid of another card with Dark Magical Circle, and the banishing effect is very good. It doesn't even have to be a monster, so this is a combo that does work quite well. Sadly, it doesn't negate the effect of the monster as summoned, which would be probably a bit too strong, but other than that, I feel like this card is a bit underrated. It's not amazing, but for a budget version, this card actually does stuff, I would say. Double Torrential Tribute, because you don't really have a high monster count on board, so most of the time torrentialing, even if it's like one of your Dark Magicians, doesn't really matter all that much, especially if you have Eternal Soul up your sleeve. So this is probably more devastating for your opponent than it is for you, so at least at 2 I would run this card. Most people that know my control budget decks will know this is one of my favorite cards, because it can end an opponent's turn just by itself, and for a rare card I take that any day. One Magician and Navigation, it's mainly because you can discard it to the graveyard with Apprentice Illusion Magician, which can be quite nice if you draw both of them, or you search it with Magician's Rod because for some reason you have nothing else to search. It can still fulfill its purpose that the card has. If you have one Dark Magician in hand and you have Dark Magical Circle, then you can still use this effect to play it, so I like running at one. But if you go for the fusion kind of variant, you can summon, you can swap it out with Secrets of Dark Magic, because this card does a tiny bit more for the deck in combination, well, Magician's Navigation doesn't. That's, in short, that is what I meant. Solemn Judgment, a very important card in this deck, because back row is your life and Lightning Storm your sworn enemy, so you definitely want to have at least one Solemn Judgment and include it in here, because most people will still have it from the packs that you get to open, and where Solemn Judgment is included in the master pack kind of a thing. If you don't have it, just run a third Torrential Tribute, it's still fine. You just have to unseat if people get rid of your entire back row without you being able to do stuff. And last but not least, Eternal Soul, a very good card to keep you in the grind game. Also, it has a downside, it could wipe your entire board, but you see when a Torrential Tribute, not too bad. If your opponent gets rid of it, you're kind of screwed still though. That's the problem. And now 2 cards that you could run, but I decided not to. Dark Magician Girl. Oof. I decided not to run because it's super rare and it doesn't really add too much. If you play specific versions, like one with the fusion and whatnot, you could run it. It's not terrible, but a lot of the times you're stuck in your hand, you do nothing with it. But you could run it. Maxi, obviously a great card for this deck. Magician Souls, I don't think anyone has to tell you why this card is powerful as it is. Dark Magician, the Dragon, whatever it's called, the fusion, the Dragon Knight, it's a good card if you can get it out, but you have to play Eye of Timaeus to really utilize it, because you don't run any dragon monsters. So I decided not to go for it, because you still can search Eye of Timaeus as of now in this specific game. So I don't think I would run this card ever in any variant really, but you can obviously prove me wrong. Upstart Goblin, a great card, especially if you use it in conjunction with Soul Servant, which is an amazing card, but it's an ultra rare. You could run it at 1 if you drew it. It's not gonna make the deck any worse, but this deck without Magician Soul, this card makes a bit less sense, because you kind of need a Dark Magician and stuff in your graveyard, but you won't have that most of the time, because this is not what this specific deck does. You need it in like lots of later turns, and then just placing one card at the top of your deck without being able to draw into it is a bit strange and not really needed. So it's a good card, but in this specific variant it doesn't do as much as it could. Distant Rivals, another card I wanted to talk about. It's not great actually. If you want to run a card that relies on having a Dark Magician on board, and you can't even activate from hand if you only control Dark Magician or something like this, then it's probably Champion's Vigilance. This card does a lot more than Distant Rivals does, even though this card's technically a blanket negate, but if you use it during your opponent's turn to stop them setting up a board, then you won't actually use this into a lot of monsters. And if your opponent already has an established board, trust me, they will not let you activate this to turn off their whole board. Like, there's only very slim scenarios where this card actually is as overpowered as it might read. So I feel like Champion's Vigilance does kind of the same thing, but actually stops your opponent in their tracks more than this card does. And last but not least, Magician's Salvation, a card that you can run, especially if you have one Dark Magician Girl, it's fine. If you play triple Magician Souls, it's fine, because you can send it to the graveyard as well after you use the search effect. I didn't feel like it was worth running in this deck, because all it does is search your Eternal Soul in this specific deck. So super rare, I felt, did nothing, and Thousand Knives, if this card was a quick play, would include that one. Since it's not, it doesn't do anything actually. It really doesn't come up at all. For the extra deck, basically just a cheap rank 7 kind of stuff, whatever you have. You can run a lot of stuff. I think the High Even Magician or something exists, the counterpart to this one, which is super rare in the Legacy packs. So if you have some of them, you could run them. They're not terrible. Even Illusion Magician, probably the card you want to go into the most. But there's other kind of cards that annoy your opponent and in specific scenarios can be neat, like number 74, like number 76, possibly Infinitrack, Mountain Smasher. They're okay, but the card you would mainly be using is even Illusion Magician, because the effect actually does stuff for you. But even then, a lot of the time you wouldn't go into this card at all. So that's it for the deck profile. If you like it, give it a like, subscribe, do all of these things other YouTubers tell you to do. But most importantly, I hope you have a good day.